Alright, now just to make the view bigger, I'm just gonna even close this toolbar by pressing this down arrow, and we can have a bigger workspace now. So again, let's start off with exposure, contrast, white balance. So let's start with the basic module here, where you'll see exposure. Now if I were to increase the exposure, it'll just increase for the whole image. We don't want to do that because we already, if I press Ctrl Z to undo or Command Z to undo, you can see we already have a decent enough sky, and we mainly need to work on the shadows. Okay, like the rocks and all are pretty dark here, so we'll do that. So we'll not touch exposure right now. We'll start off with by increasing the shadows first, just to get these rocks correct. Okay, you can see, boom, we've been able to get this out now. And we can decrease the highlights also, because this is just too bright in my opinion. We have some nice colors and clouds here, so we can just decrease the highlights. We get a lot of details back. So you can see just by doing these two steps, we've been able to go from this to this. Huge change, right? Okay. Now, whenever you're doing these exposure changes, keep an eye out on the histogram. Okay, for example, if I just show you the, let me just undo this. So whenever you want to undo some particular setting, you can just double click on it. For example, if I double click on highlights, just take it back to the original or the default, which is 0, again on shadow. So this is where we started from. Always keep an eye out on the histogram. Histogram basically shows you if it's too much on the right, these waves that you're seeing, it's trying to show you that a lot of portions of this shot are completely into highlights. Okay, you can even see it shows whites. At the extreme, whites means that totally white parts of your shot, which are bordering to white. Highlights are just one step below that. That means brighter parts. Then you have exposure or the midtones, which is somewhere in between. Then you have shadows and blacks, which are totally black. Shadows are just less than black. So you can see that right now, most of this image is concentrated on highlights and whites and shadows and blacks. That's because of the rocks and the bright sky. Okay, a good histogram usually is like a center mountain in between. Okay, doesn't have to be always the case, but at least just knowing the histogram shows you what the problem is. And when we corrected this highlights, just see what happens. This kind of moves this side towards the middle, right? Because we decrease those highlights. Similarly, when we increase the shadows, we're pushing it in the center, like this. And now we get that mountain-like thing in the center, so it starts to look much better. Now, what about whites and blacks? Okay. Now, whites and blacks and the contrast slider, these work very similarly. Okay, let me show you how. First of all, what is contrast? If I increase the contrast slider, just observe what is happening. Okay, what the contrast slider does is, it of course increases the contrast, but what does that mean? It means that it is darkening the dark parts and brightening the brighter parts. Okay, so just see. Oops, not tint, contrast. So this was original. Just see when I increase it. The rocks are getting darker, the skies are getting brighter. Right? Now we don't want this. We want, so the brighter parts are brighter and darker parts are becoming darker, but this is not a very good way to correct your contrast. Why? Because you're basically going by your eye. You're not doing something that is technically giving the correct amount of contrast in your image. You're just relying on your eyes. Okay, so I'm going to double click on contrast so that it comes back to 0. And then the correct way to do this is through whites and blacks. Okay, now how does it work? Let me first of all show you. If I increase the whites a lot, okay, so let me increase the whites. Obviously the white part here really starts to go towards the right. And if I just hover over this icon here, which says show highlight clipping, it just shows you those red areas, and those red areas mean that Lightroom is trying to tell you that in these areas, wherever it is showing you red, there's actually no information. You have pushed the whites so much that is basically white pixel. There's no detail there. You lost detail. So if you were to take out a printout of this shot, those parts, this whole red part, would actually just be plain white, and you don't want that because we don't want to lose our sky. Right? Similarly, if I push the blacks to less, like I make it really black, and I go on this side and I hover over this show shadow clipping icon, you can see it shows you this blue. Blue means similar to the whites thing with the red, but in this case it's just saying that this is too dark. That means these areas where it is showing you blue are black. If you take a printout, these will be black pixels printed. You will have no detail there. So you don't want either. What you want in order to get a good contrast is, listen carefully, what you want is just enough whites so that you can stop right where the clipping starts. Okay, so let me show you what this means. If I hold down the Option key or the Alt key, so Alt on Windows and Option on Mac, if I hold it down and I move around the white slider, just see what has happened. It kind of turns this image into this look, and what it's trying to tell you is, if I increase the whites too much now, I'm holding down the Alt and Option key, I'm not releasing it. This is telling you that any area where you can see that colored thing coming, you're losing detail. And if I decrease this, if I start decreasing it, we're losing less details, okay? So you can see your job is to stop right where you start to see just like a dot or just very less of this. What does this mean? This means you have moved whites to that point where you're just barely clipping a few pixels. You're not clipping any detail, just a few pixels. Okay, similarly with blacks, you're just clipping only very less, something like even this. Okay, now what this means is that in your shot, we have a good amount of whites, but not to that extent where you start losing details. We have a good amount of blacks, but not to that amount that not to that extent that we start to lose details. And a combination of these two gives you a technically good contrast in your image, rather than just increasing this contrast slider and relying on your eye. Okay, because with that you can actually lose details because you cannot come to know what exactly is happening. But here we're actually working along with the histogram and doing this. And let's see what changes this produce. So you can go on to this toolbar icon if you see on the left, and here there's a tab called History. If you open up History, we go back to, where did we stop before this? We stopped at shadows, right? So this was at shadows and we went all the way to here. So see the difference. If I click on this, this is what happened after we added the whites and blacks. So you can see a huge amount of good contrast came. This is where we stopped at shadows. The image was a bit dull. But if I go back here, it just adds that contrast and just gives that punch to your landscape image, which is really, really nice, right? So this is how we add contrast. Let me close this. Let's go on to our next step, which is going to be, where are we? Exposure, contrast, and white balance. White balance is going to be pretty easy.